Hello, I'm Ben Emlyn-Jones and I am here at the home of Matt and Menna of High Wycombe Paranormal. I'm here today to talk to Andrew Johnson. Hello Andrew.
Hello Ben, how are you doing?
So Andrew, tell us about yourself and what you do.
Well Ben, my background is actually in software engineering, as I've said many times before. So I left university in 1986 with a degree in computer science and physics. Worked in the field of software engineering for on and off for about 20 years. I currently work in essentially what you call student support, and I'm also doing part-time tutoring for the Open University on a computing course.
Now there's many interesting subjects that I could talk to you about, and we could be here for hours with all the subjects you cover. But one in particular I want to get into is this little object you've got with you.
I'll get that.
Yeah, so this is very interesting. Now, it's a skull, but it's not an ordinary skull, is it?
No, this is actually a replica for a start off, so people thinking that we're handing around a real bone skull, it's not actually one of those. And this was found in a cave in 1930 near Chihuahua in Mexico. And it was eventually, after a long story, carbon dated, found to be 900 years old. And, when you look at it superficially, it looks human. But when you actually start to study it more closely, you can see there's a number of features like the eye sockets are only half an inch deep. The actual configuration of the suture lines, these lines which join the bones together, significantly different to a human skull. The skull has no sinuses, and the bone is very hard. It's also very light. It's much lighter than a human skull, and also the cranial volume is higher than an equivalent human skull. And this, of course, was taken around various places, various people by Lloyd Pye. He came into contact with the skull in 1999 when it was passed to somebody that got in touch with him, Ray and Melanie Young, who are the current owners of the real skull, and they live in El Paso, Texas. Lloyd campaigned for many years to get this studied and looked at properly, and I've sort of taken up more of an interest in it recently because he sadly passed away almost 2 years ago now, and I'm concerned that knowledge about this skull is going to be suppressed, and people are not going to study it to the required level.
Yeah, and if it is what we think it might be, then there is going to be some suppression. We can sort of theorise that that's likely, because this, even though it may appear slightly human, it's not completely human. As Andrew's just said, there's a lot of differences between this and other skulls, there are skulls which have abnormalities. For instance, I've seen them myself. There's a pathology museum at my hospital where you see they've got the remains of skulls with people with hydrocephalus and things like that. Now, I know some doctors, such as Dr. Steve Novella, which is a good name because he tells a really tall story. Dr. Steve Novella has claimed that this is a skull with hydrocephalus, and Lloyd and he had a long debate about this, but this is totally different, isn't it?
It is, and just on that particular point, because it's the one that perhaps comes up most commonly, you can see, I don't know if you can zoom the camera in, Neil, but if I put my finger there, you can see that there's this dip here, which proves that this is not the skull of a hydrocephalic person, because it has this dip, and with hydrocephaly the skull inflates more or less uniformly, and you would not get this dip. So that alone proves that this cannot be from a hydrocephalic. So it's as simple as that, really. And anybody who can't see that, there's really essentially something wrong with them in one way or another.
Now the skull itself is not even normal bone, is it?
No. The bone has been dissolved and chemically tested, and it's not like human bone. It's found to be more chemically similar to collagen, which is like tooth enamel. rather than normal human bone. It's much harder. The agents which they'd used to dissolve the bone, human bone, for DNA testing, which was done in 2003, didn't even dissolve this bone. They left it for a week, and it didn't even dissolve this bone. So that proves that it's different to human bone.
You mentioned DNA testing. This is very interesting. What obviously I'm very keen to know. I'm sure the viewers are very keen to know what were the results of the DNA test.
Well, there was some confusion over that because originally it was tested in 1999, and it was actually at a police lab, I think in Canada somewhere. And I'd advise people to watch Lloyd's lectures on this to get the full information. But they produced a sort of slightly suspect result and declared that it was human. And so that Lloyd Pye thought it was the end of the road at that point, because he knew it wasn't human, but because the science, at that time had said that it was, he had nowhere to go. It was then retested in 2003, and they recovered mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down the maternal line. And that test, Lloyd interpreted that at the time with the results they had, that they thought it had a human mother, but its father was an alien. So there was talk, and if you read Lloyd's book called The Starchild Skull, he will tell you that story, how he came to the conclusion that it was a human-alien hybrid. And that kind of situation stood until 2010 sort of time, when another geneticist came forward from the former Soviet bloc, and he did what's called shotgun DNA testing with a new technique that was at his disposal, and he did this voluntarily, and he began to recover the nuclear DNA, which then basically showed that this thing has no connection to human beings. The current status of that, I think they've retrieved several tens of thousands of base pairs altogether, and it's about 50% the same as DNA as human. Compare that to a chimpanzee, 98% similar. Then how come you've got something that looks so similar in the skull to a human, yet the DNA is only about 50% the same? So the current situation is they want to recover the whole genome, 3 billion base pairs, so that they can prove beyond any shadow of a doubt that this does not belong to a human being of any description. It's something totally different. And to me, as I understand it, this is physical evidence, real physical proof of alien beings having visited the Earth on at least one occasion 900 years ago.
Yeah, and there are probably others. I mean,
yes, there is another one now as well, apparently.
Yeah, because this is what is interesting about this is obviously this is very old and long. Of course, we do have genetic modification in our society. Excuse me, genetically modified ability to genetically modified organisms.
Genetic engineering, indeed. Yes, yeah.
Obviously, this is long before that, but this could be a product of a culture from another world which did have this ability and was present on Earth. Now, if you study, obviously, the place to look is maybe historical records. Obviously, this is before there were historical records in that part of the world, but there was mythology, and mythology from all over the world talks about the presence of what we would today call extraterrestrial beings on our planet living alongside humans. In the book of Genesis, they talk about the Nephilim and the sons of God who came down, saw the daughters of men, saw they were fair, took of them many wives, who then gave them many heirs, which implied hybridization.
Possibly, and Lloyd, when the idea was that this was a hybrid skull of a hybrid, Lloyd did talk about what were called the star being legends from that part of the world. They had these myths and legends that beings would come down from the stars and give them a child to look after, and then years later they would come back and collect this child. So, does this fit into that picture somewhere? I don't know, but there's certainly, in terms of the physical investigation, more work to be done. Starchildproject.com, if you go and look there, they are still looking to get more funding for these tests, and you could get yourself a replica like this. I believe they have some left. So if you wanted to get one and help the research, then that might be a good way to go.
That's a good idea. That's hope Any viewers that might be interested will pop along, get their copy of the skull here. This isn't the original skull, we should point out, but it's a facsimile in resin. Help fund this really, really important project, and hopefully we'll get more answers soon, get the entire genome of this creature.
I hope so.
Now, another subject you've looked into in great detail is this is what you're best known for, I think, and that is 9/11.
Probably, yeah.
9/11. Now, you've got your own ideas about 9/11. I know not everyone within the 9/11 alternative community shares your views. Some of them have been quite bluntly stated that they think you're wrong on this. But what are your actual views on 9/11 and what actually happened on that day?
Well, I try not to have views on what actually happened, because you can establish what happened by looking at the photographic record, video record, and even weather data, which is something that not many people talk about. And of course, that's been done in meticulous detail by a person that you and I know, Dr. Judy Wood, who's written the book, which I will get.
Yeah, we should show the book
so that people know what it looks like. Where Did the Towers Go? Which is 500 pages of meticulous graphs, and I've even got a free DVD that's dropped out there I give to people. And you even have this guide which shows you about the site, what happened at the site, or what the aftermath of what happened looked like, which Dr. Wood produced. And some of this differentiating what's in this book from what's in some other books. Some of this was put into a court case. You don't put views into a court case, you put evidence and conclusions, which you then get cross-examined on by the court if the court case is ever heard properly. So certainly as regards what happened at the World Trade Center, I don't have a view. I know what happened, and as Dr. Wood says, what actually happened is the towers didn't burn up, they didn't slam to the ground, they turned to dust in mid-air. And when you look at the evidence, you'll see you can't really disagree with that conclusion. It's those that do have been either they haven't studied it for long enough, or they have another agenda. Sadly, and that's the sort of they have an agenda side of it. Is kind of what I've written a book about.
Yeah.
Which has made me rather unpopular in various places. But this is not an issue of popularity, of course. It's an issue of the truth and what the implications of that truth is or are. And, that's a whole sort of field of discussion in itself. Okay, but the basic situation is that the towers turned to dust. That needs to be explained. The essential explanation for that is in the book Where Did the Towers Go? And it shows that there is a technology exists which can turn steel girders to dust in, maybe a matter of an hour or so, something like that. Yeah. And once you accept that technology is real, which is a huge job in itself, showing people that that's actually what happened, then you move on to, let's look at that technology, find out who owns it, find out who's responsible for it, and what we can do with it, rather than using it to start a fake war on terror. The views side of things, going back to views, you can have all kinds of views about, whether Larry Silverstein was involved, how much he knew, how much George Bush knew, how much Israel knew, how much Mossad knew. I've had a lot of arguments about that, and I've been involved in some of those arguments. But there is actually very little argument about what happened to the towers, or there should be little argument about it, because all you need to do is look at the video record and so forth, as I've already said.
Well, you think so? I mean, it's frustrating. I mean, I share your frustration about how this evidence has not been accepted. Has not been accepted by the alternative views on 9/11 as it should have done.
No, it's actually not been accepted at all.
Your book, 9/11 Finding the Truth,
yes.
You actually document your own personal journey.
Yes, indeed.
Because I've myself had a personal journey into the 9/11 truth movement, as it's called. And the first thing, of course, most people are going to do when they start questioning the official story of 9/11, that it was a plane, 19 hijackers, Osama bin Laden, etc., is they're going to go onto Google and they're going to find architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth,
correct,
reinvestigate 9/11 UK, etc., etc., and there you'll be told the idea that it was explosives, it was thermite that brought these down, and now in your book you provide a good sort of overview about why that might be. Obviously, I mean, not all these people have a dark agenda. Some of them are honestly mistaken.
I agree.
But I think, I think, as you explain in your book, if to order to cover up 9/11 completely, you have to. It has to be a multi-level cover-up, which will include some of the. Opposition.
Exactly. Whoever destroyed the towers knew that there was going to be a few people that would be looking more closely. Beyond, knew there'd be a few people who didn't have TVs, didn't have radio, didn't read the newspapers. They would just see the coverage and think that's not right. And I was drawn into this scholars group, in 2006, 2005. So that I discovered that was essentially, a kind of intelligence operation. That was two people setting up a group to, attract people like me, so that they could keep an eye on them and find out what they were emailing, what was in their heads, what they were posting, and then you can manage that problem. If you need to get that covered up, you manage that problem, you manage the perception of those people in that group and those who that group interact with. So that's one of the key phrases, is perception management, which of course, a lot of the topic you talk about, Ben, on your program, and the talks that you give. A lot of that is perception management, because there are many very significant areas that we talk about, which we feel, which is why we're doing this interview, more people should know about, think about, analyse, and yet they're not given the opportunity to do that because their perception is being managed, using all these techniques. But what just to add to what we were saying a few minutes ago, those same techniques work inside the truth groups as well as on the mainstream media and so forth. That's what I discovered, and it's kind of much to my chagrin. So people need to be aware of that. They need to be aware that the truth is actively covered up almost everywhere, and they need to think for themselves, study the evidence for themselves, which is what's in this book. You won't find talk about Israel and Mossad, and if you want to read about that, don't read this book.
It's about what happened.
It's about what happened. It's a forensic investigation of a crime scene.
That has to be the first step. Always what happened before you start working out who done it.
Precisely.
What happened. And I mean, what the official, unofficial story also gives is a useful straw man, because you mentioned the perception management within the alternative world as well as the mainstream world, and sometimes those two overlap, because now the BBC in particular have created a number of documentaries, if you call them that, about 9/11, in which they address and correctly dismiss the thermite theory. And I myself was asked to be on one of these documentaries. They wrote to me and they asked if I'd take part, and you can guess what my reply was to them. I won't say it on the air. But I mean, what it does is it means that those who start looking into alternative view of 9/11 will come across a theory which can effectively be very, very easily dismissed, and so they will never even get to the point where they will be studying works like Dr. Judy Wood's.
That's right, and I've had people contacting me saying, "No, I didn't know I could get this book from you." And I've been selling this book for like 4 years. People still don't know that they can get it within the UK. So
yeah, and I mean, it's amazing how little people know who have studied this. I mean, there's a guy called Miles Power, I think we're both familiar with.
Yes, indeed.
He's a skeptic. He made an hour long documentary explaining why 9/11 was not an inside job, and the irony was he was right. A lot of the points he made were correct when he starts talking about the thermite and things like that, and explosives, and how it's not practically possible to bring down. It was not practically possible. It doesn't fit the evidence. Then many of us, including many people commenting in the box, brought up Dr. Judy Wood's book, and he bought a copy of it, and I don't know how much of it he read of it, but he completely misunderstood her points. Either that or he deliberately misrepresented her points in his YouTube channel. Sorry if you're watching, Miles, but it's true, you know it. And so again, but the actual truth about 9/11 is being buried far deeper than most people actually think.
Mm-hmm. And certainly in Miles Power's case, that's not his real name, so I don't use a pseudonym, so why should he?
Weather reports, Andrew. I mean, weather on 9/11? What's this all about?
Well, of course, this is one of the other taboo areas that people don't talk about, and this was the presence of Hurricane Erin, which was moving towards New York City, for 4 days before the events of 9/11.
Hurricane.
Yep, Hurricane Erin. It was a Category 3 storm at its strongest, and it moved away from Bermuda and headed towards New York City for 4 days. And then we just discovered a couple of days ago some of the footage of the news reports from about 8 o'clock in the morning on 9/11, and they've actually got the graphic of Hurricane Erin moving towards the coast.
Was anyone in New York worried about this approaching hurricane?
Well, apparently not, because on this particular clip where they show this graphic from 8 o'clock in the morning, they don't even mention the hurricane.
Because I mean, potentially this could cause even more death and destruction than the 9/11 attacks. And it was
Right.
heading towards. This was another threat, which could be even greater, heading towards New York.
Well, potentially, yes.
And nobody thought, well, maybe we should evacuate some people. Maybe we should.
Well, of course, even if it hadn't reached New York, because you've got the storm swells, if the storm stays over a part of the sea for several hours, then it makes the sea become very choppy, and you get the wash then going into New York, and it can flood the subway system. So even that could be very, very serious just from that, without actually getting any wind damage. And so this wasn't talked about, and people like Ian Henshaw, who runs this Reinvestigate 9/11 UK group, he won't talk about it. Richard Gage won't talk about it. Hardly anybody will talk about it. In fact, the people who are interested in chemtrails won't talk about it either, in my experience.
That's a shame.
So, this is another big area of perception management. People have been encouraged not to look at this, not to talk about it. But we would argue that the reason that this is involved is to do with energy.
Because Hurricane Erin very conveniently did a sort of an about turn. I think it was it turned through 120 degrees or something, and immediately it's headed due east.
Yeah, it might have even been more. But yeah, on the 12th of September, it made a right-hand turn and headed out towards Newfoundland. And you couldn't really see it from the coast of New York. So the timing of it was extremely odd. Extremely odd. And that's also documented in the Weather the Towers Go book.
Now, on the subject of energy, we could bring up energy. This is very important because, of course, we say, well, energy. Everyone needs energy. We've got these big power stations. They're coal, and we have cars which run off oil and things like that. So energy is essential for civilization. Without energy, there is no civilization. But now, the energy we're talking about here is not... And this is where Miles Powers gets it wrong, either accidentally or on purpose. He misrepresents this whole thing. Directed energy, we're not talking about electromagnetic energy here. We're talking about something entirely different. I know it's created by the interference of electrical fields. But this is a very, very powerful force that is released. And it's not... of course, it can be extremely destructive. But it could, in the right hands, do an enormous amount of good, couldn't it?
Well, that's what we would argue. And, that's essentially why we've been plugging away at this for as long as we have. But it's the research of John Hutchison, which has shown that if you mix together different types of energy, magnetic fields, microwaves, electrostatic fields, even a radioactive source, that you can create these anomalous effects whereby it seems that you can get energy input from open quote somewhere else, close quote, which we can't properly define in the standard, what I call white world physics. But it's clear to us now that somebody in what I call the black world, not my term, but that's I use that term to describe this. Black world physics is far in advance of white world physics, and they know all about how to use these different types of energy, such as the effect of the electrical energy from Hurricane Erin, which created a static field, and then interfacing that with the Earth's magnetic field, and then also in putting microwaves into the picture to create these effects in a highly precise and controlled manner, such that all the buildings with a WTC prefix were either badly damaged or destroyed outright on 9/11, and those without that received almost no damage.
Yeah, it's literally a very sharp dividing line. Sometimes on one side of the street you have total destruction, on the other side of the street no destruction at all. It's extremely odd, as is documented in this book.
Correct.
And so now in terms of use, the black world of physics, it's actually quite a good term because it illustrates this. I mean, we're actually hearing this week in October 2015 that the scientists at the Large Hadron Collider CERN are saying that they may have found that gravity itself comes in from somewhere else, quote unquote, and even these people are talking about how there are other dimensions and other universes out there. So, I mean, it could be that they're about to admit something that they've known secretly for a long time.
Well, I think that the whole CERN thing, it's a bit like the Apollo space program. It's a cover for black programs. Certainly, from what the talk at CERN has been, hasn't really changed for the last 30 years. I mean, I've said this on several interviews. When I was at university, they were looking for this W boson.
Oh, the Higgs.
And that was no. This was before the Higgs boson was ever talked about. This was in the 1980s. This was 30 years ago. They had this hunt for the W boson, and then fast forward 30 years, and it became the Higgs boson that they were looking for. That was find this particle, and we're now going to explain everything. But in essence, they it's all just theoretical physics. They don't they don't engineer anything from it. It's purely for sort of theoretical science and doesn't have any sort of valid basis for everybody's practical life. I mean, some of the technologies that they use at CERN to do these strange experiments like, for example, the World Wide Web, that actually started at CERN, as you probably were, with Tim Berners-Lee, where they needed a way of sharing the information on their computer network, better than they had. And that was where the first websites were created at CERN.
Oh, that's interesting.
So, you get technology like that, which has come into the white world and obviously transformed our lives. But in terms of energy technologies, no, I don't think you're going to see anything coming out of CERN or any real genuine discoveries that somebody else doesn't already know about.
I find it very interesting that because if you Google John Hutchison's name, he was the inventor, the tinkerer, to use the patronising language of academia. John Hutchison, an amateur inventor, he's supposedly a magician, a fraud.
According to what you read,
according to the rational wiki, which is not rational at all. But Colonel John Alexander of the U.S. military intelligence and experimental scientific wing, he does all kinds of things on non-lethal weapons, psychic warfare.
Did, yes.
He visited John Hutchison, didn't he? And it was 1982. It was around about then, was it?
1983, yeah.
1983.
Right, yeah.
He spent a long time.
He did.
Because
4 months.
4 months.
Mm-hmm.
They wouldn't have paid a man to go for there for 4 months if he was just pulling things with threads.
Correct.
So, and this is a guy actually. He turns up at conferences sometimes. He's someone I certainly wouldn't trust.
UFO debunker.
Yeah. So this is. I know you've discussed this before, but it's a possible speculative sort of timeline between how the US military got hold of this technology to the point where somebody deployed it.
According to what John Hutchison told us, that Alexander knew what the effects were going to be before Hutch started to set them going.
Really?
Yeah, so,
nice.
My impression of that is that John Alexander already knew, he already knew the technology before he visited John, which, coming from Los Alamos National Laboratories, where they get hundreds of millions of dollars in research money, and a lot of that's done for black programs, which you or I would never get any kind of access to, doesn't surprise me in the slightest.
Yeah, so John Hutchison maybe independently discovered something that they already knew about.
Correct, yes, I think that's what
whether
happened.
they got it, because there was in 1943 when Nikola Tesla died, before the undertakers were even allowed into the place, a little hotel room where he was living, to take the body away, that the FBI sealed the room, confiscated all his books, all his papers, everything he had. And of course there's maybe this is a more speculative area, but it could be the Roswell space crash and maybe other extraterrestrial artifacts coming to grief on the Earth's surface and being secretly salvaged by the government. That could also be a source of back engineering we've heard a lot about.
Potentially,
possibly.
yeah. And we can't link that to 9/11, but
not directly, no.
Not directly, but one imagines that within those programs, yes, that's the sort of area where they would develop this technology. Whether it come from something that came off world or not, we don't know, but they would have the security and the funds and the minds to develop this technology.
Yeah, right. Well, Andrew Johnson, you cover a lot of subjects. We've just scratched the surface with what we've been talking about today. We haven't got long enough to go into everything you go into. But I do think you should mention your very extensive website. There's a lot of material on there. But you have stuff about the moon landings and about consciousness and how the mind works and things like that as well. So how can viewers find out more about you?
Well, Ben, anyone can log on to checktheevidence.com, and just if you want to contact me, use the contact button there to send me an email. and I'll try and answer any questions. The recent postings are down over on the right hand side, and there's a sort of subject areas also on the right hand side, so people can find the information they want. And there's a search feature, so you can put in keywords, and if people can't find anything, please contact me and I'll try and point them in the right direction.
Oh, cool. Well, Andrew, thank you very much. It's been very interesting talking to you.
Thanks very much, Ben.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you for watching.